Chicago, 1893. A city bursting with hope. Electric lights illuminate the World's Fair as millions arrive from every corner of the globe. Families, dreamers, travelers chasing the future. But somewhere just blocks away, another attraction waited. No lights, no celebration. A woman steps through the front door of an elegant hotel. The owner smiles at her. He is handsome and well-spoken. Educated, in fact, a doctor. She signs the guest registry, but she'll never sign again. As she wanders the hotel towards her room, she notices the hallways twist strangely. Some into dead ends, doors locked from the outside, and some rooms have no windows. And one hallway just ends. And nothing. Just a brick wall. As she enters her room and closes the door, she can hear footsteps from above her. Then silence. Then the hiss of gas. She turns and tries to open the door, but it's locked. She pounds on the door, but no answer. The room grows warmer, and the air becomes thinner, finding it harder to breathe until everything turns black. Across the building, someone calmly continues dinner with guests, while another body disappears quietly into the basement. For more than a century, people have asked the same terrifying question. How many entered the place known as the Murder Castle and never came back? And the man come to be known as H.H. Holmes. Was this America's first serial killer, or did history slowly transform one murder into something almost supernatural? Tonight we separate truth from one of America's darkest legends. Hello and welcome back to Midwest Shadow Files. I'm Dan, your host and Midwest Shadow Files storyteller. Tonight's story is part one of a two-part series we are doing this week on serial killer H.H. Holmes. And this is a story that I almost delayed, partly because there is so much to cover, and really two parts of the story that make it fascinating. Number one, the folklore, some of the facts that over time have been stretched. I will tell the story of some of that lore, of course, and some of the accounts that have been stretched over time, mostly by newspaper reporters. But number two, the historical side, which dives into more of what probably really occurred with Holmes, which at times was hard to really figure out because drawing any conclusion or facts from Holmes himself was also fiction at its best, as Holmes was known as a swindler, con artist, and really a liar of liars. So even some of the details that came from the serial killer himself really couldn't be trusted, including his own journal accounts and confessions to murders. The story itself grew public attention when the author Eric Larson wrote the book Devil in the White City, and to his research credit, a lot of the details that Larson wrote in his book came from sensationalist stories in the papers at the time. Nevertheless, they were written accounts, and we'll get into some of that. But on the flip side, you have a lot of research done by Adam Selzer, who wrote another interesting book entitled H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil. And I found this to be a good counter book, looking at both sides of the coin, both the fictionalized and historical fact. Of course, there has been a lot written about Holmes, whose real name, by the way, was Herman Webster Mudgett. Some of the past accounts have him written as America's first serial killer, but without going too far down this bunny trail, I'll state here that it's impossible, because history shows a few others preceded him, like the Bloody Benders. There's an example, the famous serial killer family from Kansas, and the Servant Girl Annihilator. There's another one. Both of these examples show historical examples of serial killings well before Mudgett came onto the scene with his alias as Dr. H.H. Holmes. But if any of the reports are true on the amount of the killings, he surpassed them both combined, possibly. We'll dive more into that. But let's dive into more of the story and lore right now and circle back around to discuss and fix a few things. Herman Webster Mudgett was born in New Hampshire in 1861. He was said to be an intelligent boy, but was apparently at the end of bullying growing up. One story shares that he was forced to touch a human skeleton by other schoolmates, and this event possibly scarred him for the rest of his life. The interesting thing about trauma, if this indeed was an event that happened, is that it can go two different ways. Either it causes the person to run the opposite direction from past events, or it causes the person to run towards the very thing that traumatized them in the first place. And it seems in this case, instead of developing a fear of skeletons and anatomy, it caused young Herman to become obsessed with it. So much that he became interested in dissecting bodies and killing and dismembering stray animals. Later in his youth, he was able to obtain different teaching positions after graduating in both Gilmanton and Alton, New Hampshire, where he met Clara Lovering, where the two later ran off secretly and got married behind Clara's disapproving parents. More on this marriage in a little bit, but let's keep moving along for the sake of the story for now. Herman became interested in medicine and attended the University of Vermont, but this was short-lived, as he had bigger aspirations in this endeavor and later enrolled at the University of Michigan in 1882. Now, there are many stories from his former classmates. Some described him as being odd and dumb. Many couldn't figure out how he even was successfully passing his classes. However, he did graduate 2 years later with poor grades. It was a very suspicious time for Mudgett, everything from helping steal bodies from graves, all for the sake of medicine, of course, to retrieving bodies for cadavers to use at medical school. And apparently this sort of thing happened. Again, not to go too far down the bunny trail on this one, the point is, Mudgett was already showing some of his darker side, and it's thought to have led to an idea that later would become at the heart of one of his biggest crimes: insurance fraud. As he was working and dissecting bodies in medical school, the idea possibly entered Mudgett's idea for a future scheme using the deceased to claim insurance money. More on this. But after he graduated, he changed his name to Henry Howard Holmes. And for the rest of this podcast, I'll simply refer to him as Holmes. Nobody really knew where he came up with this name or why, possibly to reinvent himself, starting over with a new name, a new life. And some even suggest that he got the name idea from the famous Conan Doyle series Sherlock Holmes, but it's probably more likely that he simply just made it up, with no connection to anything at all. And this new life, this new name, new person, would take himself to Chicago to start over. But a little more on his marriage with Clara. The marriage didn't last long, and soon enough, Clara, having bore a child, a boy named Charles, eventually left Holmes before he was done with medical school. And she headed back to New Hampshire, taking Charles with her to live with her parents. And it probably was for her own survival. Had she followed along with Holmes, maybe he would have killed her too. Holmes eventually ventured to Chicago, found an opportunity as a prescription clerk in a pharmacy owned by a couple named the Holtons. Reading more on this story, it appears that there was a connection between the owner, E.S. Holton, which stood for Elizabeth Holton, and the University of Michigan, where she was a student. Holmes approached them with the idea to work at the pharmacy and possibly take it over at some point. Now, there are different reports of how this happened, but regardless, Holmes ended up buying the pharmacy, and after he purchased the pharmacy, the Holtons seemed to have just disappeared. The pharmacy thrived under Holmes, with the business growing, and of course, more stories of swindling and conning, but the location was prime for what was around the corner, in the growing neighborhood of Englewood, with the Chicago World's Fair right around the corner, and the millions of visitors to walk right into the hands of a serial killer. There's a lot of stories behind H.H. Holmes, and I want to make sure I keep this episode moving, so please understand some of this is mixed and some pieces together from different accounts. Some are fictionalized, but we're moving up to one of the key things in this episode that really needs to be brought to light, and that's the Chicago World's Fair. 1893 brought the World's Columbian Exposition, attracting over 27 million visitors. Hotels overflowed, businesses exploded, and it was a constant flow of people coming and going. And this was perfect conditions for someone wanting victims who would never be missed, at least not immediately. Holmes, up until this point, had many shady dealings. He never was divorced from his first marriage with Clara and ended up marrying a second woman who was unaware of his first marriage. And with all the shady dealings and crooked deals he was operating behind the front of his pharmacy business, he began his grand idea in constructing a block-long, 3-story building, a site that was across the street from his pharmacy, a project that would take over 3 years to complete. Locals would nickname it the Castle, which included a main floor with different shops and shopkeepers, and a second floor which Holmes kept for himself, and eventually a construction of a third floor, which would operate as a hotel for the future oncoming fairgoers, people who would undoubtedly need a place to stay during the World's Fair. The next part is up for debate between researchers, but it was said to be a huge space with a confusing maze, with many windowless rooms. It had secret passageways, false doors, stairways that led to nowhere. Some of the doors would only be open from the outside, while others opened to nothing but a brick wall. But here's the thing. Holmes was constantly in financial trouble during the construction, and he constantly changed contractors, or maybe he just wanted to conceal a deeper secret to the castle. Even today, no matter what angle a person takes on their beliefs with this building, it still remains one of the most famous buildings in true crime history. Construction workers were hired, then they were fired. Few ever saw blueprints. Rooms were added, hallways changed, secret passages appeared. Some claim they were indeed trapdoors, hidden staircases, gas chambers, chutes leading into the basement, soundproof rooms, acid vats, torture chambers, dissection tables, and of course, a crematorium. It's enough to make anyone believe that Holmes had designed a medieval death factory in the middle of Chicago and earning a different name entirely, the Murder Castle. Beginning shortly after the Murder Castle was built, Holmes was said to have murdered dozens of people. Some say he tortured them in soundproof chambers, fitted with gas lines to asphyxiate his victims and dispose of their bodies through the basement, where he would simply dissect them, strip their flesh, and sell their skeletons to medical schools. Any leftover parts he would cremate or throw them in a vat of acid. With the World Fair, Holmes saw opportunity. The first guest arrived in 1893. Some returned home and others just disappeared. But how much of that is actually true? And we'll come back to that, because first we need to dive into the murder victims right after this. Dan here, just a note on upcoming episode. Next week we'll dive into another haunting that took place in Wisconsin. A story that has been around over 100 years, and this is the story of the Ridgeway Ghost. Then after that, in the same week on Wednesday, we'll dive back into the world of cryptids and cover the story of the Michigan Dogman. Two big ones right there for you. Lots of stories with this one, of course, with the Michigan Dogman. But if you ever want to get a spooky legend tied to a cryptid, here it is. The Dogman has plenty to say about it, or at least the people who have encountered it. So right here, coming at you both Monday and Wednesday. But for now, let's get back to the story. Exactly how many victims murdered is a mystery. The number is estimated between 20 to 200. But there are many that dispute this. Holmes himself only confessed to 27. But even within Holmes' confessions, lies were uncovered when some of his confessions led to people who were either made up or were still alive and well. But here are the confirmed. There are 9. One of Holmes' most trusted employees, Julia Connor. She worked at the pharmacy. Eventually, Holmes began an affair with her. Julia disappeared shortly after Christmas in 1891. Her daughter, Pearl, also vanished, and neither were ever seen again. Investigators believe that Holmes murdered both. Another victim was Emmeline Segrind. She accepted a job with Holmes, and later friends received letters claiming that she had moved away. The letters were almost certainly forged. Then came Minnie Williams, a wealthy young woman. Holmes convinced her to transfer property into his name, and soon afterward, she disappeared. Her sister Nanny vanished shortly after arriving in Chicago. Neither sister was ever found again. And then we have the story of the Benjamin Peitzel family. Peitzel worked with Holmes with an insurance fraud scheme. The plan was simple: fake Benjamin's death, collect the insurance money, and move on. Instead, Holmes killed him for real. Then, to eliminate the witnesses, he took custody of 3 of Benjamin's children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard. All 3 were murdered. When investigators finally located their bodies, the nation was horrified, and these murders became the foundation of the case that ultimately convicted Holmes. After his arrest, newspapers could not get enough of Holmes, and eventually he confessed in the number 27. But like I said before, there was a problem. Several people that Holmes claimed to have killed were still alive. Some victims turned up perfectly healthy, others simply moved away. And here's the thing that makes reporting a story like this on this podcast so difficult to tell. This mixture of fantasy and reality. From papers sensationalizing the murders, the murder castle, and even Holmes himself. Even during his confession, Holmes continued lying, a master liar of all liars. He enjoyed manipulating the police and the public. Later, newspapers continued to exaggerate, and oftentimes, dramatically. 100 victims, one paper reported. 200 victims, said another. And even 300 victims. But investigators have never found evidence supporting these claims. And before we conclude, let's get into facts versus fantasy. Right after this. Dan here, just wanted to share a recent email from one of our listeners. Hey there, I like your story from a while back where you were talking about some of the Bigfoot cases in Iowa. Any others? Thanks for emailing in. There wasn't a name attached, so we'll just say anonymous for this one. Bigfoot, absolutely. I think with stories with Bigfoot, it's one of our larger cryptid stories out there, and there are certainly enough stories coming out of the BFRO, the Bigfoot Research Organization, to prove that. And of course, it seems every state has a story with this one. We did a small series based in Iowa and Bigfoot, but there are definitely a lot more. We have a story that we talked about, and I've really thought about diving a little deeper into, and that's the story based down in Missouri. This is tied to a creature that they nicknamed Momo, short for the Missouri Monster. Now, next week, we'll go up to Michigan and start telling the story of the Michigan Dogman, and I can't help when I hear some of these stories, how they sometimes are parallel to each other. They almost sound like they are connected somehow. Maybe not, but in my opinion, maybe Bigfoot, Dogman, Mothman, other creatures that are labeled as 7 foot tall, hairy, walking on 2 feet. And even though the Mothman has wings, there are other stories of cryptids that I feel sound pretty close. Like for example, the Mothman and the Van Meter Visitor, 2 large creatures with wings. And last week we had a story of the Mini Washatu up in North Dakota, or also known as the monster of the Missouri River. And then as we start diving into these stories like Momo and Missouri and other monsters that are similar, it makes you start to wonder. Now, Momo is an interesting story in Missouri, and we will probably start researching, getting ready to queue that one up as well. So thanks for the email and asking. And like I always say, we consider ourselves a community, so we'd love to hear from our listeners. Consider dropping us an email if you have something that you'd like to hear or questions, or even dropping by just to say hi. You can always reach us at midwestshadowfiles@gmail.com. That's midwestshadowfiles@gmail.com. And one quick reminder, we'll wrap up part 1 on hhholmes tonight, but our next episode in part 2 of the White City Devil, where we start to explore and get into the paranormal surrounding the story, coming out Wednesday. But for now, let's get back to our story. Now, let's separate the legend from reality. Fact, Holmes absolutely was a serial killer. I state this here because I heard different cases state that he wasn't a serial killer because he didn't mean to kill one of his victims. Apparently, Julia Connor might have died from an abortion attempt from Holmes, gone wrong, but if that's the case, it still doesn't excuse killing her. And then you have the case of her daughter Pearl, right? And then Holmes was only convicted of one murder, the murder that ultimately led to his death sentence. After that, any case against him was a non-issue because he was sentenced and hanged. End of story. There are many serial killers where victims are never discovered. And in the case of Holmes, we do have at least 9 pretty decent confirmed cases where the evidence points to Holmes. 9. And the definition of a serial killer is any individual who murders 3 or more people in separate events with a cooling off period between crimes is designated a serial killer. In the case of Holmes, he fits that bill. He definitely killed over 3 in the case of the Peitzel family alone. and there was a cooling off period, as the killings are suspected to have gone on over a number of years. So, yes, he was a serial killer. He was also a skilled con artist, defrauded insurance companies, manipulated nearly everyone he ever knew. And I do kind of get the case as far as like, well, he didn't do it in the same way. He wasn't like obsessed with a certain thing. It wasn't like a mental. It doesn't matter in this case, right? And even when you look at that, there was a cooling off period. Even between the children, that he had murdered. He definitely killed Howard, and then there was a cooling off period before he killed his two sisters, right? In different places, to be exact. So that's that. He was convicted and executed in 1896, and all these facts are well documented. Next, we have facts that are likely true. The building really did exist, and it really did contain unusual architecture, some hidden rooms, old layouts, a basement equipped, and evidence suggests Holmes could have disposed bodies there. Now, there's no proof that he did, in fact, do that, but maybe it's a possibility. Okay, so these are likely true. That building, of course, is no longer there. The building was torn down, and of course, there's a post office there that stands in its place today. But let's move on a little bit further. Here is what is questionable. The famous gas chambers. Many historians argue there is little direct evidence that Holmes systematically killed victims using some elaborate gas-filled room. Some rooms did have gas lines. Whether they were murder chambers is questionable. And as far as some of the hidden rooms, it's been suggested that he did use some of those secret rooms to hide furniture. So that also lies in question as well. And here is what is highly exaggerated. The medieval torture chambers, dungeon-like execution rooms, on and on. Most of these stories appeared years later, driven by sensational newspapers competing for readers. And journalists of the 1880s often embellished details. The bigger the horror, the more newspapers were sold. And perhaps the biggest myth of all is what the investigators discovered inside the murder castle. Reality is a little messier on this one. After Holmes' arrest, the building changed hands, sections were altered, and then there was a fire. Of course there was a fire, and some of these accounts relied heavily on newspaper descriptions rather than careful forensic documentation. And legend continued to grow long after the original building disappeared. The original Holmes murder castle was torn down, like I said, in 1938 to make room for the new post office, which still stands today. H.H. Holmes was undeniably a murderer. His crimes devastated families and shocked a nation. But the terrifying image of a castle filled with death traps may owe just as much to sensational journalism as it does to historical evidence. And sometimes the truth is horrifying enough, and sometimes our imaginations make it even darker. If you enjoyed part 1, I invite you to come along with part 2 of H.H. Holmes, The White City Devil, as we explore the paranormal aspects of the Holmes story. And believe me, we have stories. Even if you were to simply visit Chicago, you could find haunted tours and ghost tours that point to Holmes for some of the paranormal side quests, and obviously grounded in more lore. But the hauntings and the stories on the hauntings are there. And we're going to dive into that on Wednesday. Till next time, this episode has been written, recorded, produced by me, myself, and I. I'm Dan, your host and Midwest Shadowfiles storyteller. And this is Midwest Shadowfiles.